All right, so get this. Today we are going deep, deep into a topic that's got everyone talking, especially now that, the world's so interconnected, cultural appropriation.
Yeah, and you've given me a whole bunch of articles, notes, everything on this. Like everything from historical examples to people arguing for and against it and how it's playing out in all these different industries.
It really does seem like it's everywhere these days,
Mm.
and it's not always easy to know where the line is.
Yeah, right. And the thing is, the concept itself has like totally changed over time. It used to be this academic thing, but now it's mainstream.
Yeah, everyone's got an opinion on it.
Exactly. And with social media giving marginalized voices a platform, it's gotten even more, well, complicated.
For sure. So by the end of this deep dive, hopefully you'll not just know what cultural appropriation is, but all the little things about it, how to spot it, and, the impact it has.
We'll even get into some new research that might totally change how you think about it.
Oh, like what?
Well, for example, there's this scholar, Jason Baird Jackson, who studies Native American art and culture. In 2021, he came up with this model of cultural appropriation as, get this, the structural inversion of assimilation.
Whoa, structural inversion of assimilation.
That's a mouthful.
I know, right?
Eh.
But stick with me here. So imagine, like, instead of minority cultures being pushed to, you know, adopt the dominant culture's stuff.
Right, like assimilate.
Exactly. Instead of that, the dominant culture just picks and chooses what it wants from minority cultures, often like totally twisting the meaning and using it for its own good.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. So it's not just borrowing, it's about who has the power and who's benefiting, right?
Exactly. Like, think about colonialism. European powers, they, like, forced their culture and language on the people they colonized, and they were really suppressing the native cultures.
Yeah, definitely.
Cultural appropriation can be seen as, like, that same thing continuing, but in a sneakier way. So it's deeper than just, say, someone wearing a Native American headdress to Coachella. It's linked to this whole history.
Exactly. That headdress thing, while super obvious, is just the start. The real damage comes from how it keeps inequality going and makes stereotypes worse. And a lot of times we don't even realize it's happening.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's break down some of those harmful consequences. The first one that pops into my head is how the meaning gets all messed up and lost.
Oh, for sure. Imagine like a sacred ritual being turned into some trendy dance move, or a spiritual symbol being mass-produced and sold as fashion. When you take these cultural things out of context, they just become things, like they lose their power.
And of course, who usually benefits from that commodification?
Yeah.
The dominant culture, right? Think about all those white artists who made millions off of, like, rock and roll, which came from black culture.
You got it. And that difference in who's getting the money shows another layer of harm. It's not just about misrepresenting a culture, it's about who profits and who gets left behind.
That's a really good point. It's like they're making money off something they didn't even create, while the people who originated it are struggling to get recognized or paid fairly.
Exactly. And that brings us to trivialization. When something that means a lot to a certain group is suddenly trendy, it makes it seem less important. Like it reinforces this idea that minority cultures are just there to be, consumed by the mainstream.
Right, like cornrows. They became this huge trend with celebrities a while back.
Oh, yeah.
But to a lot of black people, it's not just a hairstyle. It's part of their history, their identity.
Exactly. And when people outside the culture wear it without understanding or respecting that, it becomes appropriation.
Okay, so we've talked about distortion, commodification, trivialization. What about stereotypes? How does cultural appropriation play into that?
Well, think about blackface, like one of the worst examples. It made black people into these exaggerated caricatures, and it just made those racist stereotypes even worse, and they're still around today.
Yeah, that's an extreme example, but even the more subtle types of appropriation can still contribute to negative stereotypes, right?
Absolutely. Think about a movie that portrays Native Americans as like these mystical shamans or warriors. It's relying on those old cliches that aren't even real.
Or those Halloween costumes that reduce entire cultures to a single outfit.
Exactly. Those representations, even when they're not meant to be bad, can make stereotypes worse and give a distorted view of those cultures.
So cultural appropriation has some serious consequences. But is all cultural exchange bad? Isn't it possible to engage with other cultures in a respectful way?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, and that's where it gets really tricky.
So we've established that cultural appropriation is like way more than just borrowing stuff. It's about power, context, and the impact it has.
Yeah.
But like, how do we even navigate this? How do we know when we're crossing the line from appreciating something to appropriating it?
It's a tough one, that's for sure. There's no like magic formula. But there are some questions you can ask yourself to, make sure you're being respectful. Like, first off, are you actually acknowledging where those cultural elements you're drawn to come from? Are you giving credit where it's due?
So it's not just about like enjoying a type of music or fashion. It's about understanding where it came from and the people who created it.
Exactly. And just as important is understanding the historical context. Has this culture been like pushed down or oppressed? If so, you really got to be careful about causing more harm.
That reminds me of something I read about Native American imagery in sports, like with the Washington Redskins, who are now the Commanders.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Using Native American imagery as mascots or logos, even if they say they're trying to honor them, often just turns these complex cultures into like these simple and kind of dehumanizing caricatures. It ignores all the history of colonization and oppression these communities have faced.
So even if their heart's in the right place, the impact can still be bad.
Exactly. And sometimes it goes beyond just representation and becomes exploitation. Take the music industry, for example. There's a long history of white artists getting super famous in genres that originated in Black culture, like blues, jazz, and hip hop.
Right, and that brings up the whole issue of white artists profiting off Black music.
It's not just about individuals, though. It's about like the whole system that makes it harder for Black artists to reach that same level of success.
So the power dynamics are baked right in.
Yeah. And you see it beyond music, too. Like in fashion, appropriation happens all the time. Remember those Victorian ladies all dressed up in their Japanese kimonos?
Oh yeah, those silk robes with the big sleeves and those intricate patterns.
Yeah, those. Now, they might have thought they looked stylish, but kimonos have this deep cultural meaning in Japan. They're not just clothes, they're full of tradition and meaning.
So by wearing them as a fashion trend, they were basically stripping them of their context.
Exactly. And that tendency to just pick and choose elements from other cultures without understanding them, well, it still happens today, like with the whole controversy over people who aren't Black wearing dreadlocks.
Right, a hairstyle that's super meaningful to Black communities reduced to just another trend.
And often the people making money off these trends aren't even the ones the cultural elements are being taken from.
So it's a double whammy, cultural misrepresentation, economic exploitation.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
it's a pattern that keeps repeating.
Okay, so back to the question of how do we tell the difference between appreciation and appropriation? Are there any, like, specific guidelines?
It's tough, there's no magic formula. But you can start by asking yourself, why you're attracted to those specific cultural elements. Is it genuine appreciation and respect?
Right.
Or just because it's like trendy or exotic?
Because, like, check your motives. Are you engaging with the culture because you truly value it or just to look cool?
Exactly. And even if your intentions are good, remember that the impact matters more. Are you like accidentally perpetuating stereotypes, downplaying the cultural significance, or making those power imbalances worse? If so, you've probably crossed the line into appropriation.
Wow, it's a lot to think about, but it sounds like the key is to be mindful, do your research, and listen to the people whose culture you're engaging with.
Exactly. Are they cool with how you're using those elements? Do they feel respected and represented? Their opinions are super important here.
Okay, so cultural appropriation is nuanced and, well, often problematic. But are there any arguments for it? Is it all bad?
Well, some people say it's just like an unavoidable part of globalization and cultural exchange. As cultures interact and mix, they borrow from each other. It's natural. And they argue that can lead to better understanding between cultures.
Like a cultural melting pot.
Exactly. And they might point to like how musical genres fuse as evidence of the creative side of this cultural blending.
But doesn't that risk everyone becoming the same, like losing those distinct cultural identities?
Yeah, that's a real concern. And that's what fuels this whole debate. Critics say that when dominant cultures borrow from marginalized ones, it often leads to the original meaning and context getting erased.
Like taking something with deep meaning and turning it into just another product.
Exactly. And the dominant culture often benefits from that, while the marginalized culture gets, well, more marginalized.
It's such a tough balance, celebrating diversity while respecting boundaries.
It is, and that's why it's so important to have these conversations and to approach cultural exchange carefully. It's about recognizing that you could accidentally cause harm and working towards a world that's more fair and respectful.
So we've looked at arguments for and against cultural appropriation, but how do we actually recognize it in our own lives? What are some warning signs?
One of the biggest red flags is when something's being used out of context or in a way that makes light of its original meaning, like those Native American headdresses being worn as fashion at
Right,
festivals.
taking something sacred and turning it into a costume.
Exactly. Another red flag is when people from the culture that originated it are discriminated against for the same things that the dominant culture embraces.
Like when black people get criticized or even punished for wearing dreadlocks or braids, but when people who aren't black wear them, it's suddenly fashionable.
Exactly. It just shows the double standard and the power imbalance at the heart of it all.
So pay attention to context, power dynamics, and what people from that culture are saying.
Exactly. And be willing to, question your own assumptions and motives. Why are you drawn to those things? Do you really understand their history and meaning? Are you being respectful? Those are important questions to ask yourself.
So it's not just about avoiding appropriation, it's about actively promoting appreciation.
Yeah. It's about really understanding different cultures, celebrating how rich and diverse they are, and engaging in ways that benefit everyone.
Welcome back for the last part of our deep dive into cultural appropriation.
Mm.
So we've talked about a lot from the history to the power stuff and how to tell if you're appreciating or appropriating.
Yeah, and now we're going to really see it in action by looking at some specific examples from different industries.
Let's start with entertainment. It seems like every day there's a new controversy about a movie, TV show, or music video that's being called out for being, culturally insensitive.
The entertainment world has a long, complicated history with this. One of the worst examples is blackface, which thankfully isn't as common anymore.
Yeah, it's crazy to think that something so offensive was considered entertainment.
It is, but it shows how appropriation can be used to make those bad stereotypes even worse and, keep racism going. And even though we don't see as much blackface now, we still see appropriation in movies and TV a lot of times in how they portray minority cultures.
Right, like those characters who are only there to represent their culture,
Yeah.
and they're not really fleshed out as, complex individuals.
Exactly. Those portrayals, even if they're not meant to be harmful, can still make stereotypes worse and give people a skewed view of those cultures.
So it's not just about avoiding, like, making fun of people. It's about showing other cultures accurately and respectfully.
And that means making space for authentic voices and stories instead of relying on those same old, tired tropes.
Speaking of tired tropes, let's talk about the fashion world. It seems like there's always some new trend that's being called out for being culturally insensitive.
Oh, yeah. Fashion has a long history of borrowing from other cultures and not giving credit where it's due. Remember those Victorian guys wearing turbans?
I can picture it, those fancy dudes with their elaborate turbans.
Well, those turbans mean a lot to Sikhs and Muslims, religiously and culturally. They're not just fashion accessory.
Right, it's way deeper than a trend.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand the culture behind something before you adopt it, especially if that culture has been marginalized or oppressed.
That makes me think of the whole thing with non-Native American designers using traditional Native American patterns in their clothes.
Oh, yeah, that's a perfect example of how appropriation happens in fashion. Those designs often ignore the sacred and ceremonial meaning of those patterns, and they become just, decorations.
It's like they're making money off someone else's culture and not even caring about what it means to those people.
Exactly. And that brings us to another big point. Cultural appropriation is often about who's benefiting. Usually, the people getting rich off these trends aren't the ones the cultural elements are being taken from.
Okay, let's move on to sports. We talked about Native American imagery, but are there other examples of appropriation in sports?
Well, think about team names that take from other cultures, even if they say it's to honor them. But as we've seen, good intentions don't always mean good results.
So even if a team says they're honoring a culture, if they're doing it in a way that uses stereotypes, it can still be offensive.
Absolutely. It's not enough to just say you mean well, it's about how you do it.
Right. And it's important to include people from that culture. Do they feel honored or do they feel exploited?
Exactly. What they think is crucial in deciding if it's respectful or appropriative.
Okay, last thing I want to touch on, language. How does appropriation happen in the way we talk?
This one often gets overlooked, but words are just as powerful as the clothes we wear or the music we listen to. Think about how people from the dominant culture adopt slang or phrases from marginalized communities. Sometimes it's innocent, just trying to fit in.
But it can easily turn into appropriation, right? especially when those same terms are used to make fun of or put down the people they came from.
Exactly. And it shows another key part of cultural appropriation, the power dynamic. When a group with more power takes from a group with less power without understanding or acknowledging where it came from, it can make those inequalities even worse.
So it's like taking advantage of someone's culture while disrespecting it at the same time.
Exactly. And it reminds us that cultural appropriation can even happen in something as simple as language. You got to be careful about the words we use.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation. We've explored how complex cultural appropriation is, looked at real-life examples, and talked about the arguments for and against it.
It's been a great deep dive. So, as we wrap up, what are some key things for our listeners to take away?
I think it all comes down to respect, understanding, and truly appreciating the richness and diversity of different cultures.
Well said. Culture isn't something to be bought and sold. It's about honoring the traditions, values, and beliefs that make us who we are.
We need to be aware of the power dynamics, talk to each other, and try to create a world where cultural exchange brings people together and everyone feels respected.
And with that, we've reached the end of our deep dive into cultural appropriation. Thanks for joining us.